So, I know there are other things you want to ask about. I took more than 2 minutes. I'd be happy to try to answer the questions you have and to try to go through this as best I can.
Yeah, let's open up with Patty first.
It sounds almost like when the project got started, between when the project was first discussed, first approved, and when the funding actually came through, there was a really long time lapse. And I think the question that people keep asking over and over again is that it seems as though you put a lot of faith and responsibility on Mark Barnhart, who, although he was here and did a fantastic job of speaking to our committee, and I heard him at the finance subcommittee as well, he has some experience in his past with the town of Stratford, I believe, with some building projects and some cleanup sites. I don't think that was really within his job responsibilities, and it feels like to me that you put a lot of the meat of this project onto Mark, and the time lapse between when it was discussed and when the funding came about brought up the question, why wasn't an independent estimator hired, or a project engineer, or somebody that could better have meshed those two incidents together so that we had a better idea as a town of what we were getting into?
Right. That's a fair question, and Mark did end up having a lot of responsibility, more than he expected. When that time came in the spring of 2010 and we were bidding the project, we actually had about 3 meetings in my office about that exact subject. Twig Holland, Mark Barnhart, Bill Hurley, I don't remember if Dick Saxel was there or not, but Tom Bremer was there, and we talked exactly about this project team and how would we do this. The consensus of the group, because I actually was suggesting individuals to be an owner's rep beyond Mark. I had suggested Tim Daly, Vince Como. I even sent Bill an email and said, Bill, do you remember those conversations? Do you remember why we didn't do that? And he said, yeah, I remember it got kiboshed, but I don't remember why. We had those discussions. The people that were advising me didn't feel we needed it because they felt, and I agreed with them in the end, and I take responsibility for that, that the vendors we were hiring to monitor the project and to inspect the project were those people. We really had more of an oversight team than any other project that the town has ever done. If you look at the fact that we have STV Engineering, and if you look back at the bid and you look back at their contract, they were interviewed based on their knowledge of how to supervise construction sites. They were not hired as a construction manager, but they were hired to construction coordinate. That's why they ran the monthly meetings every week. They had to sign off and recommend to Mark on every change order. They had to look at every day's work on that site and determine, was it valid based on the design plan. That's what they were hired for. They were also hired to do all the paperwork to the state. And so everybody who was on that committee that made that bid, that RFP'd that contract that STV ended up winning, it was a bid that STV won, felt that STV had the capacity to do that monitoring and that work to give us the inside sense of the site. In addition, we had what's called a licensed environmental professional company. We had Lerero Engineering, which is one of the biggest environmental companies in the state. They work on huge brownfield projects. And they had been hired to be the company that developed the remedial plan. They have the responsibility under DEP requirement to sign off on all the remedial work on the site. So they were out there. STV had 2 to 4 people every day on the site. Lerero had 1 to 2 people every day on the site. And their job was to be out there as the eyes and ears of the town, hired by the town, nobody else, hired by the town, to manage this work and to watch what the contractor was doing. The way transportation projects work, they're not normally bid construction management style, because in a construction management project like our school projects, if you remember, and you know this because you were on one of them, we bid out all the trades, and then the construction manager comes in, supervises all the trades, and manages the finances, makes sure all the trades contractors are doing the job right. We did this by the general contractor method, which is the other approach to construction projects. The state said that's the way they do transportation projects, that's what we should do. So we hired a general contractor. The bid winner was Guerrero Construction, and they have the legal responsibility to complete the project, do the bid the way it was spec'd out in those design documents, in the bid. When they started finding things in the bid that did not match the conditions on the ground, that's when the difficulties, whenever that happened, like with the dewatering, groundwater contamination, they came to us, I think it was the second month of the project, or maybe it was even the first month, and said, hey folks, and I think they talked to Bill first and Mark, and they said, your number that the architect and the engineer put, Parsons Brinkerhoff, is ridiculous. We found 5 times that in the state work that we did, because they managed the state project with the platforms, and that 75,000 is not going to be near enough. We think it's going to be $1 million, and it turned out to be worse than that. But we really thought we did have a strong team. We do have a strong team. Could we have an estimator? Could we have had an estimator? Perhaps. And could we have had another person monitoring construction, as the First Selectman is doing now? In retrospect, I wish we had a building committee, but nobody at the time felt. I even talked at one meeting about having the TFC review this, and everybody on my team was like, oh no, we don't want to slow this project down. Don't worry, this is under control. That's the way it worked. And
it sounds like the project was being fast-tracked, and having listened to a lot of explanations about transposition errors in numbers, someone not going out to the site and actually measuring how much drainage pipe needed to be on roadways, that was an enormous overrun number. It seems like there was a lot of pushing this project through, and it may have been felt as though we had eyes and ears on the ground. However, those companies that were hired, their primary responsibility is to make money. It's not to be beholden to the town of Fairfield. There are no taxpayers that work for that company. There's no town volunteers that work for those companies. They have no responsibility to the town of Fairfield except to get paid. And so, it just all goes back to a project of this size that did not have more oversight is a little disturbing. And I would hope that looking into the future, now we're looking back a lot, and I'm not sure what conclusions will be drawn, but I am certainly hoping that moving into the future that nothing like this will ever happen again, that the oversight that is provided for any project, whether it be small or large, will be appropriate, and that we have some guidelines put in place.
And in retrospect, I have to say I basically agree. If I had realized that we were having a risk of $2 to $6 million a year ago, maybe we would have put more people on the ground or tried to figure out what we could do. We thought we were in good shape. I mean, these primarily appear to be unforeseen conditions, as far as I can gather. And it's similar to Tomlinson. We had all these general construction manager, we had the building committee, but that project went over, and sometimes it happens, and it is very frustrating. But
some
I
were
agree.
and some were not unforeseen. We've had this question asked of pretty much everybody: what overruns were the result of unforeseen conditions, and what overruns were the result of perhaps not appropriate supervision? And I'm thinking that a lot of the overruns are falling into the bucket of not appropriate supervision.
We were stressed with time. The parties wanted to get this done in a certain time schedule. The state in particular was pushing for a good reason, because they wanted to open the train station, which they were almost finished building on the other side of the tracks. But that's what happened.
Thank you.
Well, on the timeline, so it's the state, because
the
it
DOT,
seems,
when I say
well,
state.
or DOT, but it does seem like even if it cost us a month on the timeline, that so many projects that the town does, I mean, it involves some sort of a building committee or something to that effect. It seemed like this one was held very closely, and I mean, I guess in a sense you're falling back on that you were sort of advised, even when TFC came up, that it might create a delay, but in the interest of, not having the types of issues that we've obviously seen, I mean, it just seems odd that on this project, one of the largest projects that the town has done, that none of the things, building committees use the estimators, right? Building committees have, when we're doing something like that, they have, you mentioned like the construction manager, something to that effect. And then they've got a group of citizens dealing with it. And I don't think, had a building project, maybe $1 million plus, been attempted without a building committee, I can't imagine there would be backlash. I mean, it just wouldn't have happened. So it seems surprising that it.
And in
it wasn't
retrospect,
done.
you know, what you're saying is being proven correct. You know, we should have done it that way. You know, I have to agree. I mean, we had the state also monitoring it and supposedly looking at it with the DOT representatives, but the fact is, we could have done this perhaps in a different way. I think if I hadn't thought it was going so well for so long during that first 9 months, and so confident, you know, overconfident, I guess, that we were coming in on budget, but it just didn't, you know, materialize till the point at which, you know, this last 30% of the work was being done, and it's a shame. Believe me, it's not fun sitting here having to answer to that, but yeah. And I take responsibility for that because it was ultimately my decision.
And I just let's move on.
Yeah, I just have
Mr.
first
Carl.
of all, thank you again for coming in and the hard work that you did on the grants. I think that's very important. I personally, I still think it's a very important project, you know, for the town. Just trying to understand, you know, some elements of it. When going back to sort of the independent cost estimator, which I understand is slightly different than having a construction manager. During your time as a first selectman, for any of the other sort of larger projects, I guess like Ward would fall under that and such, was an independent cost estimator used on those projects?
Perhaps once or twice. Usually the construction manager did that work. I believe there were a couple of projects where a separate extra cost estimator was hired. I honestly don't remember which ones. But most building committees just use the construction manager for that purpose. Some building committees opted to hire a cost estimator.
Yeah, because one of the things that Mark said, you know, last week at the meeting was obviously, you know, hindsight, everyone has 20/20 visions. He said, but it would have been helpful, you know, on this project to have an independent cost estimator. And obviously, you brought up sort of inflation. We all know anything sort of related to petroleum, you know, costs more today than it does 10 years or so ago. But the cost overrun variances that we got last Friday from Mark seem to have less to do with sort of petroleum-related elements. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe could.
Well, I was talking about the kind of growing from, say, 6 million, or in effect, you know, what we considered probably back then, with all the parties, a $15–20 million project, to now a $30+ million project. So, in other words, the bids that came up to 29 million had all that petroleum escalating costs in there. The things that have happened recently are other things beyond those things.
Okay.
And
fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ken, I just want to go back to the red flag that you got 2 or 3 months into the project, where we have a budgeted amount of $75,000, and I think this is going to cost $1 million. Okay, so there's the first red flag, where $900,000 off, based on something that somebody's taking a guess at. Weren't there other, I mean, these experts that we have there, I mean, there's a red flag 2 months into the project. Were there not more red flags that came up and said, well, this estimate here is way out of whack? And if there was, why weren't these dealt with at that time to reevaluate the budget? And I guess the question is if we have I'm assuming that the contingency was about $1 million?
well, when we put together that $29 million thing, we assumed about a $3 million
$3 million contingency,
of
which in 2 months into the project, we're already 1/3 into, just based on something, and they haven't even really put a shovel in the ground around the water issue. Why, at that point in time, don't we take a step back, take a look? And again, hindsight's 20/20, and I'm just wondering if there was a discussion with your team, if somebody said, and then all of a sudden we decided to plow along, and if we did, why? Again, I'll go with the same thing. It feels like there was, and I understand the push, the state wants to get it done, they invested all this money.
No, we wanted to get it done too.
Right, everybody wants to get it done. But why, if there's red flags popping up all over the place, why isn't there somebody saying, okay, we got to stop, we need to take a step back, reevaluate? I understand it may cost us more money on the back end, but it may save us money in the front end. Is there a discussion? Was there a discussion? Is there anybody who can tell us that we made the decision to move forward because?
Right. It's a hard question to answer. The difference in the dewatering groundwater contamination issue was almost everything in the contract was unit pricing, and it was based on an estimated quantity, estimated sidewalk, paving, estimated paving, estimated yards of dirt to be moved around, and all that had a cost per unit. So, $10 per shovel or $20 per ton of concrete, more like probably $100. The groundwater item, the dewatering item, was not that because there was no way to quantify it per unit. So they came in with this lump sum amount, and that's what stuck out very differently than all the other stuff. I guess we relied on our architect, our engineer, that gave those quantities, that had looked at this site for years. I mean, Parsons and the vendors that created the design had 5 years to look at this site. And I think the belief was that they quantified things based on a pretty good knowledge of what was there on the ground. And I do believe if you look at most of the work came in pretty close to those budgets. The areas that appeared to be going over were areas that were not in that project design. If there's stuff, and I shouldn't again get into things after I left office, but let's say when I was there was dirt that was beyond what the design, the 30 acres had, and it was going out because they were finding more dirty dirt beyond that area. Well, the architect, designer, engineer wouldn't have quantified that in a bid until they discovered it. So I guess the real answer is, did we have enough contingency? And we thought about 15% was enough, and in retrospect, this is about 25% potentially overage when you add everything up.
David, I just got one more. The budgeted number that you gave to us, the estimated costs, construction costs, which is on the last page of the report, which totaled the whole 38, right? $38 million, is that where I am, right? Or total estimated construction cost, $29,643,000. That was the total dollar figure that this was estimated to cost, and this was the estimate that was done somewhere in the neighborhood of April of 2010?
Yeah, it was done in, I think, February, March, but it was signed in April.
Okay, so well, I guess
Correct.
the question I have is, there was an estimate done in 2002 or 2003 when the project started, and now we re-estimated the job, obviously, because we're 8 years later. Is this the same company that estimated it off the original, or did we get a fresh look?
The original estimates, from memory, were very conceptual. It was not kind of design ready or even 10% design ready when we sought the approval to go forward.
The building was still there.
So I don't believe that Parsons was hired back then. STV certainly wasn't. This estimate was primarily Parsons, Lorero, and DOT's engineering division. They did the work to kind of give us the kind of, line by line where they thought the bids should come in. And then again, when the bids came in lower 3 months later, in June of 2010, it appeared their estimates looked, valid, but.
I guess where I was going, so none of this was, well, this is what they said in 2002, so we're going to take a cost of living increase, and now this is what they're doing.
No, it was a whole new estimate.
Whole new bid. They went out there, they took a look, and so nothing that was done 8 years ago prior was okay. Thank you.
And and not to belabor, but just to give you a big example, in that initial iteration with 2003, which some of you remember was also a very long, time-consuming process to get the approvals. One of the things that was not in the original agreements at all for any party was the whole excavation and grading of the site. The parking area of the site was 20 feet lower than the hill where the bridge was landing, and nobody had kind of figured out, okay, well, how much is it, who's going to do that? And BlackRock Realty volunteered to do it. They said they were going to do it, but the agreement didn't require them to do it. So those were the kind of things that over time, when this all, got more contentious in 2005, 6, and 7, became big problems.
I guess that about.
Good.
Thank you.
Mr. Jones?
I guess the question I would have is one of the things that we're looking at now is cost overrun for contaminated soil and getting that potentially off the site. Contentious issue has been all along pulling the town's conservation department off of the project. In retrospect, what we're looking at now, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, and that it has brought us to where we are now.
Well, I'll answer it this way.
Do you have any?
If it's okay. You know, obviously, I and Conservation Commission made some tough decisions. I started that process in 2007, and a large reason for it, and the staff, you know, Conservation staff worked for me, so, but a large reason for it was my belief, and I believe, you know, I have the, you know, I believe this was so, that the staff was creating situations where the costs were escalating because of things that were being done or being attempted to put more obligations on the developer and on the site and on the town. And so I don't see how it would have saved money to have the staff end up finishing that work, because it had cost, I mean, the developer has estimated about $2 million more in this project due to the conservation staff's requirements that the commission approved. If you look back to 2004, when the staff made their recommendations to the commission, if they had recommended to the commission that the entire site get treated to residential standards and everything get put in a landfill, which would have been $100 million, according to BlackRock Realty. So, I think I made the right decision. I don't think this project would have gotten restarted, unfortunately, if we had conservation staff involved, because there was a pending lawsuit that may or may not have reappeared because of the fears that they would delay the project and, you know, cause cost escalation. So, you know, it all happened. We've had a lot written about that, and it was a tough decision. I didn't like doing it. Believe me, it was the last resort, but I felt that I and Conservation Commission had to do that.
Just keeping in the theme of the oversight that everybody was talking about, another area where it seemed to be a lack of oversight.
But remember, we had, you know, the other firm that was hired by the Conservation Commission, Redness and Mead, and they've been out there every week, and they were hired to do that job for the commission that the staff would have done. So there is an independent consultant for the conservation, wetland areas, all that stuff that's on the project beyond the project team that I helped manage with Mark.
Right, but it seems as though they've underestimated the size and the scope of what needed to be cleaned
I
up.
mean, I'm not an environmental expert. I can't imagine anybody would have known some of this, no matter how much they looked at it. But I don't know. I can't tell you whether it could have been discovered earlier. I don't know.
And just on the soil side, there are some areas where some permits earlier on were pulled, and right now there's some questions about just how far out they had to go ultimately. To your understanding, were there some limits that were in place that should have been, you know, that possibly exempt us from going so far out? I mean, how did you understand in there? Because that seems to be, that's a big variable here that then fell most specifically on the town at the end of this.
It appears
so when you, for instance, when we entered into this 2010 contract, and we took those burdens. Now, I understand where you're going, that with the potential 15 million costs, and so that we were easily, in your view, 10 million over anyways. So, you know, but I'm trying to, I guess, understand a little bit there as to how far you thought it really could go, because it seems like it's gone maybe further than you thought with the soil. So
I would phrase it this way, you know, and again, you know, I'm not an attorney, I'm an accountant, and I can only kind of attest to what was happening, you know, when I was there. The plan, the way we approved it, the way I felt we approved it, the original agreement basically had each party responsible for their kind of environmental soil. The 2010 plan, the way I understood it, was the town had agreed to manage the work for the various environmental aspects of the entire site based on the extra money we got. But it was based on, and the reason I believe this was because we had to initial all these pages at the time when we agreed to it and append it to the agreement with BlackRock Realty and the agreement with the state. The design plan called for specific areas to be worked on and called for specific discrete locations to have all this environmental work done. And My understanding was the design plan and the bids were certainly based on that work. I don't know the legalistics, and I wish I could tell you as to if it has gone beyond that, who ultimately could be responsible. I just can't answer it.
Yeah, that's not even where I'm going there. It's just that you had signed a contract. In your view, we had a large liability that we were facing if we actually wanted to start this project, so you went up to the state and you did that. And that's great if that's where we were at, and you needed to take, to get funding in, and we got the funding in. But in turn, while doing that, you then opened us up to a potential for a large amount of liability. It could be a small amount, at the end of the day, it could exceed the original amount, and some may say that it actually now does, and if we don't get the revenue back, if it costs us over $6 million, that's 12, and maybe we were only off by 10. I mean, so it actually ultimately could end up costing us more now than it originally did. An attempt, and it happens, and that's what we're trying to find out. But in that, on the soil side, did you understand, that there was only, to some extent, that there was a threshold that we weren't going to cross, where maybe it appears that now we have? How did you try the variables?
All I understood was, and thought was that the design area was the area that we agreed to do the work in. If it went beyond the design area, I don't know how that works.
Well, based on what Mark said the other day, if I have it right, and some other things that have come out, it seems as though there's the design area, which maybe is where you're hopeful of, but then if you go and you test, and you basically have to keep testing to a certain degree until you don't find it anymore. And it's not just you don't find your area. They've actually, from what Mark said the other day, they actually went way out into potentially mixed areas and found specific, I guess there's a way that they can find traces from that site. And they had to keep doing that, and that's driven a lot of what they're finding.
The only thing I can recall, and I guess somebody would have to look at the permit, when before all this happened, when BlackRock Realty and the town sought the permits from DEP back in 2005, 2006, 2004, I remember BlackRock saying, well, we don't want to dig out Ash Creek, there's all kinds of sediment from Bridgeport, from other upstream that goes down there. And I believe, I thought I was told that the permits only required a 100-foot area along the creek to be, for clean fill to be put in, and that was the limit of the area. But that was, I don't remember seeing that in writing. I don't know if it's in writing. That's just what my memory was, because BlackRock was afraid of that risk as well. So we all kind of believed we had a discrete plan and an area that we understood, and that if there was an area that, say, on the site that went deeper, yes, that probably would end up being our responsibility in this last iteration. But if it went beyond the DEP permit area, I don't know the answer.
Can I clarify something?
Yeah, me too.
And that
My
actually,
understanding from Mark Barnhart, I got the completely different understanding from Mark Barnhart that you're insinuating now. I did not get the impression that he was saying that our soil testing has gone beyond what the original area was. My interpretation of what he said was that the original testing was done. And the way they do that is they find the primary site of contamination, and then they follow the flow of that. And a certain area from that flow is where they test. And that's how they test always, every time. And when they did that, they were not finding enormous levels of contamination. And that's where the problem came back, because when they actually, that's how they estimated the project, was by that testing from the flow of contaminants within the original area. However, when they actually got to putting a shovel in the ground, the contamination did not match what the testing said. So they did certain boreholes where they would expect contamination to be, and they came up with moderate to low contamination. But when they actually started dredging and cleaning, they found more than that, and it was a very unusual situation, was my interpretation of what he said.
And what I was trying to, and I think that you did answer it though with you were working off of a potential assumption of that 100 feet, that there's some point where it should have stopped, and that's, I think, maybe a follow-up with Marcus to clarify if they went beyond that or not. But yeah, I think for my purpose, you did answer basically that there was a point where we thought it was supposed to stop, and so I guess
And again,
so
I'm
whether we went out or it was
I
just
thought
within there, like
when
you're
Mark
saying.
was here Friday night, that when you talked about Ash Creek, there was a point where they did not have to go out beyond. But I think where we're running into the bigger problem is not on in the Ash Creek, but it's actually on, and I believe it's on site, where what Mark called the plume, which is when they marked here and then they went in the direction they thought it was supposed to be. And what's happening is that it's deeper than they had originally anticipated. And they got to a point out here where there wasn't any, but then when they went a foot farther, they found more. So therefore, they had a plume again. So I think and I think those are two different areas. I think the water was one issue, and I think that was pretty much taken care of because they got to the DEP. I think the issue, and I might be wrong here, but I think the word he used was what? Casting soil, which was casting sand, which is on the site and not in the water. And I think this is where the effect came. And I guess that's where the question goes to, when the original cost estimate was done, who did the cost estimate that said, okay, you're going to have to move 15 million cubic feet or 15,000 cubic yards or cubic ton, 15,000 tons of decontaminated soil, and now we're at 60,000. And that's where the discrepancy comes from. And I think that's something that we're all a little disturbed about.
Just again, this is a layperson's answer. On-site stuff, I think we thought we were primarily responsible for, unless there was a reason, that one can show that we weren't. But the railroad did those initial estimates. They estimated about 300,000 cubic yards of soil being moved around on the site, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this 30-acre site. It's a huge amount. So 5 to 20,000 yards sounds like a lot, but out of 300,000. We had always, we were determined, we were going on the assumption we would cap it on the site and keep it there, because we all believed the cost of going off-site to a landfill would be a lot more, and that's what our plan was.
So the cost estimate was based on what we knew to be the total amount of casting sand that was going to be capped. And that's where we are, and now that's where the discrepancy is as to whether we can cap it. We might be able to cap it, but we have elevation issues, and we have to go back and forth, and these are but we're actually at almost, if I remember my numbers right, and I don't have my notes with me, we're almost 4 times as much casting sand that was estimated that we're actually finding. That is in that lower echelon.
Lower area.
And I don't have my notes with me, but I remember something about 15,000 to 60,000.
Yeah, and that kind of, I wasn't, I didn't have any of that information when I was in office, so I don't know, where that was.
Yeah, the only reason I'm going to you on this question is there was an estimate to, and again, either remove, because some of it had to be removed. We knew some of it had to be removed, because some of it was just not allowed to by the PCB regulations. But X amount was going to be left on the site and capped, and now that X that was there is now Y. So, and I guess the question is, so you're saying that the X, when we had this originally estimated, was done by part of the estimating team that you put in place back in the...
Yeah, it was the environmental consultant and Parsons that did all the estimating for everything in the bid documents, and we relied on that.
So that's, okay, thank you.
And like I said, for my purposes, you're there, and I think maybe I'll send an email to Mark when he gets back to clarify on that, which will tie into what Mr. Flatto put in. So, Mr. Hurley?
I just have 2 quick questions. In terms of the contingency, I'm assuming the internal working committee that you had in place came up with that number? Is it?
Well, the original, I think it was actually, it may have been DOT personnel that recommended the 15%, or roughly, or 10%, whatever that, it was about it's in this breakout or not. It's not on this sheet, but that was basically the same folks that came up, that did the estimates for 29 million. It was some DOT engineers, it was Parsons engineers, and they built in a contingency. I know it was at least 10%, and I don't know if it was as much as 15%, because the 29 million included soft costs and all that. So I think of the construction part, it was estimated at around 15%.
I'm not a construction expert either, but would an independent cost estimator, if hired from sort of the onset, also have reviewed the contingency, or maybe you don't know the answer to that question?
I would imagine they would. I know in most of our other town projects, usually 10% or so tends to be the number that people use, but...
And then my last question actually goes back to the 60 questions that were submitted to our current First Selectman. And there was one question, which was, why did the town buy 9 acres of parking land in 2006 before the foundry? This was original question number 49, and our good First Selectman answered that. And he said, I believe this question is best asked of the former First Selectman Ken Flatto, and I don't know if you're prepared to answer that tonight, or submit something to, if you could also submit something to him in writing, 1 or 2 sentences, and then we could plug it into the document. It'd be very helpful.
And Attorney Saxel perhaps could help with that, because he handled those transactions in terms of the paperwork and all that. But roughly, the foundry was taken down in 2004. I look back at the building permit, and the only thing that was left was a foundation in the ground. When we were going through this iteration of, how do we get from here to there, we reached a point where we felt we wanted to have control, and the state was starting to build the train, the platforms and the bridge. We needed to try to, get some control of the part of the site that was going to be the public parking land. So we decided to make the transaction. We had received the federal grant. There was no town cost for the land purchase, so with Senator Dodd's help at the time, we received a federal grant for $4 million to pay 100% of the land cost, and the value of that land is apparently much higher, so we got a good deal. So I guess the question was, why did we do it before? We did it after the factory came down. What some folks are alluding to that are environmental, I guess conservation specialists, are, there was a question about the foundation of the factory, and that foundation was still there. And so the question was, you bought the land, and what Dick and I talked about, I think this is a few months ago, was, and this is again from memory, was the foundation of that area, and the concrete there was going to be reused as part of the parking lot materials, part of the ground up stuff that was going to be used. So there was no downside to us. The factory was gone. So maybe there's a technicality that the factory would include the foundation, and therefore, the land should have waited another year. I'd have to let the lawyer.
Would you be willing
that.
to give Mr. Petro something in writing on that, so we can put it into our document?
I can, yeah, sure. I can give a note, and then again, it might be helpful for Attorney Saxler to help.
That'd be great.
Help on that.
Thank you.
Sure. Can I maybe get into the one thing that you mentioned that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No, if you have something else, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to get to the other item that you mentioned about the revenue, the back. If that's okay, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
because I would like to help clear this up, because there's been a lot of confusion about this, and I'll just do my best to spell it out the way I saw it. There were two elements that were not really gone into much, and I wrote this in my little write-up, that were not presented as part of the presentations when we presented the documents in 2010. And the reason for it, in my mind at the time, was not that secret or that controversial. I didn't believe it was going to have any impact on the payback afterwards and the amount the town was going to get back afterwards. So I was so focused, we all were so focused on the cost part, getting this thing done and then getting it started, that we were all focusing on the 29 million primarily. But it is true that the original agreement had language that the town has rights to the first $300,000 a year for 20 years of revenue after all the state's expenses, that's what the original agreement says. I don't want to read the whole thing to you, but it's in the original agreement. After the state's expenses, we have a right to $300,000 a year. That's still the case today. That has not changed. What the issue is, the state said, we're spending more money now, and we want to recoup those costs, those expenses. Well, the original agreement gave them that right, whether I signed a letter or not. They wanted me to sign a side thing saying, hey, we want to clarify to make sure that this is the way we understand this provision in the original contract. So from my point of view, we didn't have a choice because they weren't going to give us the money, and we were not going to have a project, or we were going to have a project where we were going to have a big liability to the town to finish it. So it made sense to me. But there was also something that none of you seem to have been told about, and that is that the town is saving $4 million during that period that we would have had to pay in reimbursing the state from future tax receipts for the cost of the road. That was in the original agreement. So while we had to put $6 million up front, if you look back at the original agreement, you look back at the minutes, you will see that there was talk back then about how much the town was going to have to pay back later to reimburse the state for grants the state was giving for the expense of the road. Well, in this final iteration, the state was, the $19 million included the road. And the road roughly is costing, I believe it's about $4 million. The state, in the original agreement, would have gotten that $4 million back plus the interest of the cost on the $4 million. So, yes, we may not get all of the $300,000 a year, and I don't know whether we will or we not. Some people don't think we will. I think we will get some of it. It depends on the price of the parking passes. It depends on how many people, how many are oversold, all that stuff. But what I need to let you know about is we had an offset in terms of our liability and our exposure later in the future years to revenues that would have potentially in the first iteration, if the state had given a grant for the road, would have had to been paid back. So should I have explained all that a year ago? Probably. Would it have confused people just like it has for the last 2 months? Yes. And everything was so complex and so to begin with that there was a lot to explain. I erred. I didn't talk about something that was out there, that I didn't see it as part of the construction project. I was focusing on the construction project, and I don't, in my heart, I guess I didn't believe we were giving anything up net. And I don't know how it plays out.
All right, so only because I'm not following it, so I want to just go back to the beginning. Originally, we were going to get $300,000 a year for 20 years to get the $6 million back we originally put on, but also the state was going to also possibly before that take back $4 million first to pay for the grant that originally was supposed to go to BlackRock Realty to build the road.
Correct.
So and now the $4 million plus the cost that the state was going to put in to build the railroad station, or was that not part of the state reimbursement money?
The original agreement had you mean the platforms and things like that?
Yes.
Yeah, no, the original agreement had the state's responsibility and obligation as the platforms and the bridge. So because that was their obligation, that wouldn't be something in the original agreement that they would have gotten reimbursed for. But costs for the part, and if you look, I actually have it here, if I could just reference it for a minute. And it's in a sole discretion, conduct shall pay all the costs of the collection system. To the extent there is any revenue earned from parking, or parking revenue, conduct shall pay the town the first $300,000 of revenue net after all operating and maintenance costs and expenses for the surface parking area and its improvements. All these monies are now going to the surface parking area and its improvements. So the state wasn't going to pay that $19 million in 2003, so they didn't have that.
Well, that's what I'm asking, and it says surface parking and, what was the word? I'm sorry.
And all the improvements.
And the improvements. So the road is part of the improvements to this parking?
Well, the state certainly feels that way.
That's, okay, so what we're looking at
I
is...
should say DOT when I say
Right,
the state of
DOT,
Connecticut, I apologize.
but the actual platforms and those parts are not part of that existing. So the state was gonna put the platforms in, they were gonna pay their $8 million to build the platforms and the bridge.
Right.
That's done. Then we're gonna finish the train station under the original contract. We're gonna put it in the parking lot. The parking authority is gonna take over, and we're gonna get $1 million a year out of parking. I'm living in the pie world, I know that. $300,000 is going to come to the town, and the balance of $700,000 minus expenses, or
Correct.
the
In other words-
state gets the first, they pay their expenses, then the state gets their portion, and then the town gets theirs. So
Right,
the
so
town
this-
is third in line,
Correct.
regardless of whether the 29, and that's before the 29 million, and now the state may or may not include the additional monies put into this project as part of that agreement, because without a train station, we don't really need a parking lot.
That's pretty, I believe that's a good summary of it, yes. I mean,
Simple.
uh,
Okay. So it's really in the state's hands now, and we'll find out when we're done.
And the 4 million, you said it was through tax receipts? How is that going to be paid?
It's called incremental tax financing. The program that this town of Black Rock had applied for, I think it was in 2003 or 2004, no, it couldn't have been 2003, 2004 or 2005. Basically, the way it works is a certain amount of money gets paid over to a private party to do work on a public project, and the money gets repaid from the revenue that gets generated from the site, from any tax revenue that the site generates in the future pays back the loan. And so whatever the assessment of the land, of the property and the improvements to the property are, you know, when it all opens, that tax revenue would be, some of that revenue would, instead of staying in our town tax account, would have been paid to the state.
And it would have been 100% of it each year until paid back?
It would have been,
Or-
we never got to the point of figuring out, was it 200,000 a year, was it 100% until it was paid back?
But over
I
a
don't
period
know.
of time, you're essentially saying, that under the original agreement, we would have lost 4 million, be it
That's,
5 years or 20 years, whatever the term may have been that we worked out. We were going to have to turn over in property tax revenue
right,
from that
that's, and
commercial
Paul Hill,
site.
and Paul Hiller said that 2 weeks ago at the Board of Finance
Just-
Subcommittee.
Yeah, just making sure. And now, based on the new agreements, we don't have to do that.
Correct.
Okay. Anybody else have anything before I go again? Or? All right. The other thing is, a lot of questions have come up around the, basically around BlackRock Realty. And you had mentioned earlier that of the 19 million, that, I mean, give or take, you know,
Yeah.
let's say half.
Guesstimate.
Half was to cover town, you know, some of that town exposure. The other half was for public work, included with the $5 million that they were then gonna put in. But it was essentially work that BlackRock originally was supposed to do, that there were some money issues about.
Yes.
So, I guess it's been said before that BlackRock may have, in a sense, gotten off a little bit easy with this, that there was a lot of, that some money came down and work that they were potentially going to be liable for now that they didn't end up having to, you know, to do, or they did for, let's say, the $5 million fixed cost. I mean, there were a couple of things there. What, you know, how did that play in your decisions? I guess, you know, when you piece it together with the state and BlackRock, you know, surrounding that 2010, can you give a little bit of background as to how, you know, decision-making that allowed that, in a sense, for them to get off easy in that situation, or not turn over more, you know, more land, or some of those types of things? How did we end up there?
Yeah, I guess I would just characterize it this way. You know, we had a very, you know, hard negotiation, not just with BlackRock, but their lenders were at the table in 2010. And it was a very hard negotiation to come to a point where the three parties under the three-party agreement felt it was fair and equitable under some form of what we believed was the intent of the three-party agreement. And when BlackRock Realty did put some more money on the table, you know, that That amount was debated a lot in the negotiations. You know, I shouldn't talk about the exact negotiations, but in the end, you know, we felt that it was as reasonable as we could make it from my point of view, from the town perspective. You know, I felt it was very reasonable because the way I was looking at it was we were not laying out. My belief was at the time, my hope was that we were not laying out any more than we originally budgeted 8 years ago, whereas the other parties were. So I thought we were way ahead of the game in 2010, you know, because BlackRock Realty was paying more and the state was paying, you know, and thank goodness, by the way, for the state, you know, for doing what they did back in 2010.
The other thing, it's more information. I don't know if you have these schedules, or if they may fall into records under the current administration, you know, to get them. But did you make? You had mentioned the 03 estimates and then costs rising to the 2010 estimates. Do you have those schedules, or did you produce them so we can go back and, in a sense, you have figures in here, you know, with that 15 million. I mean, those types of numbers. Do you have something that backs up how we got to that assumption?
What there is in the file somewhere is there was a document, and I assume Mr. Saxel would have a copy also. There was a document, when I tell you there was that estimate, that budget that was put together of about $29.5 million, 29.6, there was a 3-4-page financial budget that laid out the different pieces of that, soup to nuts. I mean, it wasn't as detailed as the bid documents, because the bid documents have a line for sidewalks and everything, piping, but it laid out all the key components of the $29 million, so that is in the file somewhere. And that would give you kind of, when I came up with these numbers here, I actually, with respect to the First Selectman, I actually just looked at the sheets that he gave out at the RTM last month, and I just looked at how much was the parking lot, and how much were the utilities in the parking lot, and so I kind of came up with my numbers roughly off that. But there was a document that you should be able to get a hold of. I don't have a copy of that at home.
And that's for the 03 or for the
10, April 2010.
And do you think that there was some? I mean, I'm assuming that there would have been something in order to come for a town funding request, or because it's not in. I can go back and look again, but I don't recall that it was in the.
Oh, you mean the original?
Filed with the town clerk. It would probably rested somewhere within the administration, all the documents. I guess I'm trying to build the 03, because one of the things that you had noted is a lot of these costs, things, you know, like fuel and paving, a lot of them going up and going to a figure that then landed us in that 2010 situation, and then the agreement in part, you know, covering some of that. So I guess I'm trying to see if we can build the 03 assumptions, the 2010 assumptions that you had used to then say, I've got a problem here, I've got to go, and this is how much I think I'm going to need. And so if we build that, the 10, and then where we're at now, I think that builds a very clear picture.
To my knowledge, there were a couple of pages that summarized an estimate of the $6 million back then that are somewhere in those RTM, in the files for those original, you know, meetings in 2003. It wasn't. I don't want to. It was not that detailed, but it estimated. You know, I know it may have even been Bill, but somebody came up with an estimate for the parking lot. You know, whatever it was, $2.8 million.
It's something that you have, though, specifically, or 100% who might have it.
Yeah,
so
I don't personally have it,
okay.
but there were documents that you should be able to get a hold of. And there was this thing in 2010 that the state put together with the town of BlackRock Realty to kind of summarize the pieces of its $29 million.
So what I'm going to do with that, and actually to Mr. Tusher, I'll send you that as a follow-up from this meeting. We'll add it to our questions list. And possibly, you know, if necessary, you know, if you think of who might, I mean, one suggestion was maybe Mr. Saxel. We can start in that direction.
I think he may have the later one, but 10,
tied
but
to it.
I don't think he has up 3.
And at least, you know, see what we can do there.
Yep. Any indication as to which file or which area of files or which?
Yeah.
Hopefully, because most of it's chronological, knock on wood, hopefully. But I can try to send you an email.
How far?
Yeah.
I was going to say, if you could make yourself somewhat available, even with Mr. Saxel by email or something, if
I mean,
you
I
think
could
of
perhaps
where
after
he
work
might
one
be
day
able
and
to look.
just help you look through if you want, but
I think it would be helpful, because you've put some numbers in here that do
I'm sure I
begin to
could find it if
clarify
I
some
had-
of it, and some of that what was Mr. Flatto, thinking during the 2010.
It'll
You
probably
started
bring
to,
back great memories in 2003.
but you're starting to build something there, and it would be helpful if we had that. So
Right, if-
I'll send you the email and anything
I'm
in the
happy to
middle
help,
of all
Mike,
that
if-
I can do
if
to
that's
help
helpful.
as well.
David, you may want to follow up with the town clerk, because it would probably be with the
Yeah.
Board of
anything-
Finance paperwork for the bonding resolution for the $6 million.
In 03, and I'll go back. They have a file. I know I've been in that file before and don't recall seeing it, but maybe I'll take a trip down there as well.
Or
and check
maybe
with the
Paul can
clerk
help you
and-
with the Board of Finance,
Yeah.
because their files might be a little bit better.
I'll run it through Mr. Tetro, though, because we're trying to
Absolutely, but
centralize.
just to-
But no, you're right, it could be, at least for the 03, which would be the oldest one, that things should be on file specifically for the approval, and then maybe working with Mr. Saxel and Mr. Flatto for the 10, we'll build the information set, so. But I think that's certainly it for me at this point. Is this good for you? Yes?
I'm satisfied.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very
Thanks,
well.
Ken.
I
Well,
appreciate
thank
your
you.
patience.
Thank you again for
and, I hope I didn't take too
reconsidering.
much of your time.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That was very helpful, thank you.
Not sure.
Thank you.